copy in the library because I donated one. So there's a Blu-ray for you. Thank you for inviting me to speak today and also for keeping it to 5 minutes. First off, I'd like to pay tribute to all the men and women who served during the Vietnam era. A lot of people don't know this, but during that time, only 43% of the people who served in our military actually served in Vietnam. The other 57% did other things in other places, but they were guilty of honor and sacrifice, like so many of us. So there we go. So what were you doing 48 years ago today? I checked in my pilot's logbook, and according to that, 29 March 1971 was the actual date of my last combat helicopter flight in country in Vietnam. So this seems kind of appropriate. How did that happen? Okay. It was a 3.1 hour flight, capping off about 111.5 hours in the month of March alone. And I had actually two co-pilots that day, Lieutenant J.G. Kane and a Lieutenant Tree of the South Vietnamese Navy. This was part of then President Nixon's plan for Vietnamization, okay? I flew Huey gunships for a year in the Mekong Delta with the Navy Seawolves of HAL 3. It was the only Navy combat helicopter squadron, and it stood up there in 1967, and it stood down 5 years later in 1972. Our squadron never existed here in the United States. It was a byproduct of the Vietnam War. HAL 3 was initially stood up in Vung Tau along the coast, but its headquarters moved to Binh Tui in the central part of the Mekong Delta in 1969, which is where I found it. It was the largest squadron in the Navy, and it had 9 small detachments in various locations. My particular location, I was on Det 9, and we were up on the Cambodian border, and that included the area around the Parrot's Beak, which is basically the end of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The NVA came down, and our job was to meet them and thank them for making the trip. It was an interesting time. Most of the detachments had only 2 helicopters. They were UH-1B Hueys. They were actually old hand-me-downs from the Army, underpowered, oh well, but we got them. Most missions involved support to riverine forces, also the Navy SEALs. Oh boy, ride to the party. Thank you, SEALs. And also to the Army's 9th Infantry Division, which also operated in the Delta region. We had 8 enlisted gunners and 8 pilots on our detachment, and usually flew 24 hours on and then 24 hours off. So whenever the call came for support, the on-duty crew knew who they were, and they would scramble, which meant that our fire teams would immediately jump into the helicopter gunships and take off in about 2 to 3 minutes and fly directly to whoever was under attack on the ground. Over 2,500 enlisted men and officer pilots served with the Seawolves between 1967 and 1972. 44 were killed in action, and at least 150 were wounded. People's experiences in war vary by when, where, and who you serve with. Today, the Seawolf Association meets every 2 years, and at our last meeting this last September in San Diego, as the captain mentioned, a new film documentary entitled Scramble the Seawolves premiered aboard the USS Midway, and about 1,000 people gathered on the flight deck to see it. So if you want to know more about the Seawolf story, you can check out the library, a Blu-ray DVD copy in the Dudley Knox Library. Thank you, Irma, for your support. You can also purchase one if you want online. You can Google it, or you can wait until about May 27th. That's when the PBS stations throughout the country have been offered the film for national carriage. I also want to commemorate the brave allies in this war, the Aussies, the South Koreans, and others, but particularly the brave South Vietnamese. While we and the Aussies and the others got to return to our home countries in 1973, our South Vietnamese brethren lost their home country in 1975 when they were invaded and finally conquered by North Vietnam. So today, many South Vietnamese have come to this country. They've integrated very well into United States society and become model citizens, one of whom is here on campus. It's Miss Rose Drake, who has worked at NPS since 1987. She's originally from Bien Hoa, which is just north of Saigon. I've been to Bien Hoa. And as many of you already know, Rose is the heart and soul of our Naval War College staff here in Monterey. So thank you, Rose, for who you are and for everything you do. Thank you all for joining us here today. I believe my 5 minutes is up, and so now it's Larry's turn. As one of our former POWs, it's entirely fitting that he gets to have the last word. And I think the secretary is not here.
No, sir.
Okay, well, that's okay. He is a Marine Corps H-46 helicopter pilot, so go frogs. Larry, it's up to you.
Lillian and I got to see the Scramble of the Sea Wolves DVD. Boy, if you watch it, you won't be sorry. It is really something. Thank you for your service. I grew up in South Dakota during the 1940s and 1950s. President Eisenhower's administration. His vice president for 8 years was Richard Nixon. These guys had a map of the world, and it showed the communist countries in red, and the number of red countries kept increasing. And it was scary for me as a little boy to hear my mom and dad talk about how it looked like the communists were out to take over the world. And then the Korean War happened during my childhood, and our country lost around 40,000 troops in that war, which was a war to stop the spread of communism. And then the next thing I knew, I was in North Vietnam in a prison after my 138th mission didn't go too well. And I'm in a communist prison camp, and every once in a while they'd throw something into my cell to read, and I read their words in their books a number of times about how their goal was to get a victory for their system throughout the world and to eradicate capitalism from the globe. They were proud of that goal. On one occasion in one of their stinking little re-education rooms, one of their officers told me, contrary to what we would like to believe, wars are never settled over a conference table. They are always settled on the battlefield. So I sat in prison month after month, year after year, thinking about those two things, that they want to eradicate capitalism, and it's going to happen on a battlefield. And made me feel pretty proud that I was over there fighting against that. It was during my 18 months of solitary confinement that President Lyndon Johnson made his famous statement, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party." And the upshot of that was that in the fall of 1968, the guy that got elected to be President of the United States was Richard Nixon. And I was stoked. I says, good, this guy understands how the communists think, and he'll kick this war off at dead center, right? Well, not too right. 4 years go by, and it's time for our elections again, and I'm still in a prison in North Vietnam. But something was different in 1972. For getting re-elected, President Nixon had the biggest landslide victory that our country had ever seen. His opposition got Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, and President Nixon got everything else. And that sent a message to the government in Hanoi. Our historians to this day, I don't think they realize the impact that election had on the government in Hanoi. And it was a vote of confidence for President Nixon. Within 45 days, he launched something called Operation Linebacker 2. And the Air Force has the Strategic Air Command, that's the B-52s, and the Tactical Air Command, that's all the attack and the fighter jets. And our Navy had, I think it was 6 aircraft carriers in the theater at that time. And they all have, of course, over 100 warbirds on them. And then the Marines had 2 Marine Corps air stations in South Vietnam, and hoorah, everybody came downtown, that meant Hanoi, on the 18th of December 1972. And I was there with in a cell with about 40 other guys and men where we still, you've heard the term sensory overload. Think about all 5 senses getting overloaded. The noise all night long was horrendous. The light show was amazing. Every time something would blow up, there'd be a flash, of course, and SAMs, S-A-M, surface-to-air missiles were corking off, and AAA, the anti-aircraft artillery, was being shot by the thousands of rounds, and even small arms. Every time a rolling thunder flight would come through, every soldier with a rifle would just point it straight up toward the sky and empty the magazine. And all of this stuff going off, blowing up, put a smell into the air that was so thick it would get into your mouth, and you could taste it. And I always say it tasted like going home, because just like that guy said, these kind of things happen. They get decided on the battlefield. It's kind of like peace through superior firepower, and freedom comes from shock and awe. That's exactly what happened. Within 90 days, every one of us was back in the good old USA. Skip forward a few years go by, and President Reagan says his famous words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And I mention this because those words take me back to my childhood and that map and the Korean War, and then what I heard about eradicating capitalism. And when I hear people say that the Vietnam War was an ignoble war, I just shake my head and I say, how so? To me, it makes me feel like I want to say thanks to every Vietnam vet, everybody that supported the Vietnam vet, everybody that participated in that Linebacker 2 operation, and everybody that voted in 1972, because not only did you bring me home, but you all added one of those little epsilons toward the overall goal of tearing down that wall. So that's my spiel. I think I'll be sticking with it, and I thank all of you for what you're doing, for your service, and without regard to what God you may or may not believe in, just in the spirit of the slogan, God bless America, I want to show you my POW jacket. Thank you.
And now you know why it's bigger than just somebody flying for the Navy. 100 hours, I don't even know, in the surge ops, I didn't even get 111 hours. And that was just flying around San Diego most of the times. And 5 years, over 5 years in a not so glamorous Hilton, when he was starting, I mean, he was in the middle of Linebacker 2, literally, and he had a smile on his face. Ken.